I was here last week for a different group, and it was a kind of highly technical understanding of the theology of architecture. What I thought I'd do today is something that will be a lot of content at a high level, but also will involve some audience participation, and to think about space a little differently, which one student in your group here was actually a Liturgical Institute alum, Jeremy Priest, who's back there, and he's actually taken the class before, and he knows that space is a word that sets me off. It's kind of a trigger word, because there are two ways to use the word space. One is theological, and that means that this inside of a building, for instance, is different from space other places. So in the Eastern Church, when you dedicate a church and it's consecrated, the Holy Spirit's invited to dwell in there, and then the inside of that building becomes sacred space because the Holy Spirit's presence is in there. It's like the invitation of the presence of God in the Temple of Solomon. When God leaves, then there's just a building. When God's in there, suddenly it takes a life. It's sort of like us with the Holy Spirit living in us. And so space can be sacred. But what architects tend to do is they call buildings spaces. And if you ever read an architectural journal, they'll say, Architect X said he created a space that was supposed to be emotive of somehow. This is the classic modernist paradigm, right? I create a space that generates an emotion. And if you study your modern theology, modern philosophy, you know it comes out from us, it's in the realm of feelings, it's not didactic or discursive. It's a space that causes emotion. But in a sacramental worldview, buildings are made of stuff. And they are made of bricks and stone and icons and images and paint. And so it's very tangible, it's very material, it's very incarnational. And that notion of a building as an image of a city is one thing, but you can also extend the Christian vision out to an entire city. And that's what I thought we'd do today, rather than focus on the inside of a church, to think about how you can think of the Christian mission extended across the landscape, so across space, so to speak, and take that and make it a city that they would call it an ideal city. You know, there's not many times you get to build a city from scratch. But there were a few in the Renaissance. One was called Pienza, one of the pious popes, built a city from scratch. And they had to decide, well, what's the most important building? Where does it go? What should it be made of? And what's more important, the private house or the public administration of justice? Or the place where the mayor lives versus the place where the bishop lives? And it's an intellectual construct that you see, but when you have to make that intellectual construct correspond to buildings, then you start building a theological reality out across, if not miles at least, you know, many, many yards of a city square. And you know, if you know your Notre Dame recent history, a lot of people were upset when they were building all these big buildings around the football stadium. They called it the crossroads of the campus. And I heard some people say, well, what's the center of the campus? Is it football or is it the basilica, right? And see the big, giant buildings, and now the basilica is a little afterthought on the side, you know. But you see, you can architecture and theology, architecture and the city values start to take place there. So what I thought we'd do an introduction to the classical notion of the city as a polis. If you look at the back side, under the columns here, we don't think of cities in the classical way very often, but the polis, as you may know, is not the place in terms of the borders and the streets and the houses and everything, but the political realm as an idea. So it's a place where people live together, they encounter each other. I heard something about building community, but you do build community. You can build housing projects that isolate people from each other. You can build housing projects or developments that the porches line up and the garages are in the back, and you actually go in the front door instead of the garage. You know, you go to a lot of these suburbs now, I call it a garage with a house attached, this big giant garage, and there's a little house on the back. But a traditional city is geared to encourage community, and so it's a political realm where you encounter your neighbors. And then the architectural rendition of that is called the urbs, and we get the word urban from that. And this is the Aristotelian view that politics is practicing the art of living together to perfect the character of each individual. So we think of politics now as corrupt politicians promising anything to get elected and whatever. That's kind of a debased version of it. But if you think about your neighbor growing up, and you know, I had an elderly little neighbor across the street when I was 13. My mom always said, go mow the lawn for Mrs. Capizal, right? She didn't pay me, and then she wanted me to come in and sit for 4 hours and eat her cake and stuff. But it was a political activity. I'm doing something good for her, which is good for me. And then you think about education as a community activity, or worship as a community activity. And so the city is the place where this political life is lived. And it can be lived in different ways. It can be lived as a purely economic reality, or it can be lived as a spiritual reality, or the political and economic can live together. And a person of good character, who's been formed by good character, chooses virtue over vice. And then when you live justly and express virtue through service, then your just people are happy. So this is the classical concept of the good life, or the virtuous life. But the good life is not a stake and 3 cars and a giant lawn you never use, like the sort of suburban ideal of the good life. And then virtuous people form just governments in a democracy. So They elect good people, and then those people are just, and they administer with justice in the dispensation of law. And so education is in the middle of this. So this is sort of the classical notion of the polis. If you've ever been to the University of Virginia, Jefferson imagined his little campus to be that. It was a little political realm where everybody would live justly. And even though he was Mr. Small Government, he started a state university because he thought education and justice would be really, really important, or else democracy would fall down. And you can sort of see that happening around us now. So what I thought I'd do first, because I know this is Catechism of the Good Shepherd people, and you're participatory and tangible and interactive, is start with an interactive exercise of hypothetically building a hypothetical polis right here on this board. So I actually need 6 volunteers and someone who knows how to use tape. Anybody willing to do that? Hey, Jeremy, I know you. Could you be the tape person? I call the tape person Vanna White, so that's you. Yeah, you don't have to know anything, I promise. All you have to do is huddle up here. Come on up. So there's 2.
I don't know anything. Be brave!
You just have to, okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One more. All right. And, okay. So, all right. I think that's good. All right. So you all have the cheat sheets, and you don't have the cheat sheets. If you look at the front of the handout, there are these little diagrams, and don't show them because they have to figure it out. And this is this abstracted version of a building plan. So imagine you're looking on Google Earth, and you're looking down on the top of a building. You see this round one. I call it tolos, that's a place for venerating. The templum, imagine that as a building with 2 little columns and a door. The theatrum is round seating, like a Greek theater with a stage in front, and so on. And so one of the notions of how you build the urbs is based on how you live. What are the things that you do? And you govern, you imagine, you live in a private way, you venerate, you celebrate, and you buy and sell. And so the building types, theoretically, are arranged according to their place in the hierarchy. So you know, if you look out a plane and in America, you'll see highways and shopping malls, and then you'll see a house next to a house. This house has a pool, this one has a pool, this one has a pool, this one has a pool. We like the privacy. We've elevated the private house to the top. But that is not the classical way of doing things. So what I'd like you all to do now is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. You might have to be a tape and participant. Okay. Now, can you hold up your building plans? Here, just hold them up to the group. Okay. So now, I gave you a bunch of different building plans. These are all the same. What I'd like you to do is arrange these in hierarchy from low to high, from left to right, by taping them on the board. So this board right here. So huddle, decide whose building plan is most lowest importance over there, highest importance over there. Look what happened. Look what happened. Just do your best. Without,
are you going to put it in order?
Do you see without a pre-existing differentiation of hierarchy, everything flattens, and then what happens? The biggest fist wins the day. It's supposed to be confusing. Don't ever do that.
Okay, thank you.
You did very well.
Okay. 5 seconds left. Okay, good. All right, just leave it where it is, How did you, just leave it where it is. How did you come to this conclusion of which building types are?
Well, we decided that somebody actually wanted to be at the top.
Yeah.
And
well, I asked from left to right, and we got up and down and side.
And then what we decided, and somebody decided they didn't want to be left that way. So we decided that the most inclusive thing to do was to make it as a circle. And then we had a leftover. And we didn't want to play.
Yeah, one of these things is not like the other, right? Okay. All right. What is? I don't want to labor this. What is the point I'm making here? If all the building types are the same, how do you know where they go? You don't, right?
Right.
Because the city that says worshiping God is the same thing as buying things at the shopping mall doesn't know how to elevate architecture, put the more important things in the more important places, and so on. So differentiation, we live in this kind of inclusive language world, and to a large degree that's right. But if you flatten out differentiation, then what happens is you flatten out the hierarchy of goods in a society, and then anything can become anything, and you do this, right? So the people who don't want to play, don't play, and so on. So, all right, now we're going to give you the actual building types. Tolos is a place of venerating. Venerating is fundamentally a private religious experience, so somebody's bones are buried there and you go venerate the bones. A templum, or celebrating, that's more like liturgical celebration. A lot of people go and it's public. The regia is a place where regulation happens, so the governor, whoever it happens to be, it's a place where authority resides. So when the president wins the election, whoever it is, they don't just govern from an office building, they move into that White House, and the White House is a regia, it's a place where authority resides. The taberna is the shop, so you buy and sell things, and then, I guess Jeremy, you need, right? You want to have two? Okay, and then the domus is private dwelling. Yeah?
Can I ask you again, I was writing a note and I missed the difference between the circle one, which is venerating, and the celebrating worship. What exactly is the...
Venerating would be fundamentally a private religious activity.
Right.
So Father Soren's bones are somewhere and I want to go
Okay.
visit his bones,
Yeah.
but it's me, by myself.
It's more like shrine.
But then if you have, yeah, shrine, then if you have mass somewhere and there's 1,000 people,
Right.
then that's still a religious activity, but it's public. So how would you arrange all these in the hierarchy from left to right? Please try to keep them in a straight line, from left to right. Okay, go ahead. Now, in traditional cities, the markers of hierarchy are that sacred is higher than secular, because it deals with the eternal. Public is higher than private, because public good is always more important than private good. In the modern city, private is more important than public usually. We want our big giant houses and our garages.
Highest is left.
Don't help me, I want them to figure out.
Oh, that's what I said. They just wanted to say which side is the highest.
Oh, yeah, oh, sorry. Actually, lowest is left, left to right.
Oh, sorry, I was wrong.
That
was wrong.
Okay, I suggest that theater go decide.
Real close.
All right, so knowing your private and public things, which ones do you think, what do you think is at the top of the hierarchy?
Next to each other.
Yeah, you should go right. That's
Right,
I agree.
yeah, those two, yeah.
Because it's secret and public. What do you think is at the bottom?
And we're going.
I'm glad they're not the same.
Okay,
Right,
venerating or
because it's private,
governing?
it already goes.
We think it should be center and
Well, what is according to this model? The
Look at
classic?
this. It's public.
The public is higher than private,
Let's be really,
and
let's
sacred is higher than
romantic.
secular.
Oh, in terms of value.
The tolos is
Right, so the private dwelling should be at the bottom, right, because it's
Yes,
public
you said it
and-
was.
I mean, private and
it's a
secular.
public place.
Okay, but he knows these rules already.
Yeah, he knows.
All right, 10 seconds.
That's not fair.
We're gonna be anti-American.
Okay, put it somewhere, time's up.
Shopping.
Okay.
Last.
All right, now don't go far away yet because you were not done. Okay, so we talked about this while you were having your deliberations. So, Taberna, who was were you the Taberna person?
No.
Oh,
I
Jared?
think I was.
Okay, how did you come up with the, I know I forced you
They
to put
forced me
this.
to.
We ran out of time. Okay, well, one of the rules I didn't tell you all up here, because you were busy, is that in traditional cities, in this Christian worldview, sacred things are of higher status than secular, because sacred deals with the eternal and the worship of God, even though the earthly realm is important and people's lives are important, but it's not eternal in that sense. And then private is lesser than public, because the public good typically trumps private good. And so we have this thing going on here.
I really think you need the house first.
Well, right, because private and secular would be at the bottom. Then where would the shops go?
Well, we decided that the shops are going to go last.
You did.
I did.
You did.
Right, now it's a little counterintuitive to us, right? But the shops have a public function. And we think of shopping malls as developed by developers and it's all commercial enterprise. But in some of the ancient worlds, it was the duty of the city to provide places for the distribution of goods and all that. So it was kind of a public good in that sense. Okay, how did we get all the way over here? What do you?
We all felt that the temple, the celebrating worship should be the highest.
Right, it's public and it's sacred, right? So that goes there. Then this part gets a little confusing. It's a little hard.
We were not clear. At first we thought if this is just private, then, it would be further down, but then it's gone and it's a public place for private worship, so
Right.
I think it should go here, but I don't know.
Yeah, some of these you could argue about. It depends how important the saint is, if it's a local saint or a universal church saint or whatever. But I think generally, sacred would go, private would go there. Then these you can argue a little bit. The place of governing is not a private house. It's not the penthouse that the president goes to on vacation. It's the symbolic residence of where authority resides. So the White House, the palace of the king, whoever it happens to be. So it's public, but also secular. And then this one, What about a theater in the classical sense? We think of movie theaters as entertainment, but if you know your ancient Greek notion of theater, what was it? What was it for?
It's for teaching the virtues to the community.
Right.
So
It's
they're
for
common.
imagining things not as they are, but as they could be or should be. So next time you see some, niece or nephew's little play and they're George Washington, I'm so sorry I chopped down the cherry tree, right? That kid is not George Washington, right? But you're supposed to imagine that that kid is George Washington. And what's the moral of that story? You imagine things not as they are literally, but as they could be, or whatever you want to imagine. So liturgy has a deep imaginative quality to it because you're imagining things not as they are, literally, in your building, but when the priest says the preface to the Sanctus, we join our voices with the angels and saints as we sing Holy, 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 that's an imagination, if you're really paying attention, of the choir. So there's the angel basses, angel sopranos, angel tenors, angel altos, and us, right? We're all in that choir, and you have to imagine that. So there's a theatrical sense to liturgy, not in the overblown sense, but in the imaginative sense. So I don't know which way these would go. Maybe this, I don't know. You like it that way better? Okay, right. So governing is important, and so it's a good way to do it. Now, we want to go with materials here. Now, materials come in hierarchies too. Now, hierarchy is a word we tend not to like in modern society because we think of corrupt officials oppressing the poor. That's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about the nature of things. Some things are more important than others. And, when I teach kids, I say, what's more important, doing your homework or playing Xbox, and they're all like, whoa, homework, of course, right? You just know it's in us. And so materials are like that too. So brick has a certain importance as material, and rough brown stone has a certain importance as material. Smooth limestone has a certain importance. Wood has a certain importance. Rare white marble has an importance. And then some concrete with stone trim, you can have that. Maybe stick those on the right building according to the hierarchy of materials. Now this might seem really easy in certain conventions, rare white marble we use for all important buildings. But imagine if you lived on the moon, what would be the rarest material to build your house out of? Wood, right. If you live on Earth, moon rock would be the rarest material, but if you lived on the moon rock would not be the rarest material. So there's a certain kind of subjectivity to this, and different societies develop different conventions. But in the Western tradition, these are sort of how our conventions have come along over the years.
Rough brown stone would be good. That's what you're thinking would make love.
They're very collaborative now, aren't they?
They're getting down.
Okay, just stick it on something and see what happens. We'll talk about it.
All right.
Okay, good. Jeremy says, Storm, the guy who put his building type over here is the guy who's not in agreement with this, he says. All right, so we have stone for the private dwelling, wood for the commercial building, brick for the regia, concrete, smooth limestone, and rare white marble. So this seems pretty right? The precious, rarest marble is used for the most important building. It doesn't have to be marble, it could be anything that's precious and rare. One of the reasons marble is often used is, one, because it's rare, but two, it actually, if you look at the physics of white marble or other marbles, it's actually semi-permeable to light in the top couple of microns or millimeter or two. And so light actually hits through the top layer of marble and bounces out. So it gives this quality of glowing with light that something like concrete doesn't do. It's just objectively in the nature of the material. So if you want something to look glorified, transformed by the light of the Holy Spirit, anticipating the heavenly Jerusalem, then a material that does that will do it well. And so there's a convention that it works. Now how about these two? Stone for the house and wood for the commerce. What do you think? You can be the zoning board of the city. Do you give permission for this, or would you have other suggestions? Because wood is temporary, it doesn't last that long, so it would be more with a private thing that also doesn't have to last that long. The concrete with stone trim is a bit tricky because this is something that in the ancient world there's something called the markets of Trajan. And Trajan, the emperor, actually built markets for the people near his forum, and it's concrete, actually poured concrete ceiling. It looks like a modern day shopping mall in the 2nd century, and has some stone trim around the doors. So entering the market of each shop has some stone trim because it's important. But then the rest of it is pretty functional. And these you could probably go back and forth. Typically rough brown stone is the tradition for the palace. Brick, I don't know what they would use for this. But you see the material choice matters a bit here. You're not done yet, though, folks, so we have a couple more things to do. If you look at your sheet, this little handout sheet, on the back there's all these column types. And you may have heard of these column types before. Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and composite. Doric is the relatively simple one. Ionic is the one with the scrolls on top. Corinthian has the leaves, and then composite has the leaves and the scrolls both. So that's a composite of the two kinds. And traditionally in classical cities, the Doric, because it was the simplest, was used on the buildings of lower importance. It took less work to make them. The Ionic was more complicated and came in different varieties. And so that would be on middle status buildings. Then Corinthian would be on high status buildings, and then composite would be on really high status buildings. So the emperor, all the Roman emperors, after they developed composite, put composite on all their own buildings. So the buildings they built, their palaces, their triumphal arches, except for the Emperor Constantine, who's the first Christian emperor. He doesn't use composite for any of his buildings, only Corinthian, and he puts composite on all the churches. And they talk about this as the donation of the composite order to God, right? Because now God is more important than the political realm. And so this is pretty interesting stuff. They had developed theology of and philosophy of architecture back then. So your job is to put the right kind of column on the right kind of thing.
We have to know the year.
You get Doric.
So what year are we in?
You get nothing. You get no problems. Sorry, you get no problems as well. So you don't. It's a hierarchy that still works. You get Ionic. You can have Corinthian.
Are you sure
And
about
you
that?
can have composite. So Doric is low, Ionic is middle, composite is high. And if you're really uninformed, you get no columns at all, right? Because it's just an outbuilding, an outhouse, a lemonade stand, whatever it is. You don't need that. This one's pretty straightforward. Now, when you walk around the world and see things, especially if you're going to older churches that are more competent in the classical language, you'll see very careful use of columns in their hierarchies, right? No columns, right at the hierarchy, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, composite. This is very simple, kind of a Where's Waldo exercise. This would probably work great with kids who love to look for stuff. Do you see Ionic? Do you see composite? Is it in the right place? Is this church as important as its columns say it should be, and that kind of thing. Now, if you find this interesting, there's a couple things going on. One is it's kind of fun to play the game. But one is we're talking about intellectual construct. Some things are more important than others. Worship of God more important than selling, pumpkins. How do you make that express in built form? Well, we're taking the matter of the earth and using it to reveal otherwise invisible or unencounterable spiritual realities. Does that sound like the definition of anything you've heard of before? Right, sacrament, right? So we're talking not the 7 sacraments at the peak of that, but there's a sacramental worldview. People are to be honored and cherished, the image of God and so on. Plants are great, but you can eat them, and you can't eat people, right? There's just a hierarchy there that's in the nature of things. And how do you mark that? Well, in architecture, this is the developed convention. In language, there are conventions like this too. If you go to see Queen Elizabeth, walk up to her, it's like, yo, Queenie, what's up, right? There's language for talking to the Queen. There's language for talking to your buddies. There's language for giving formal lectures. Commencement addresses are different from whoever, just your dining room table conversation. And so this is what they call linguistic register. This is what all that discussion was about in the translation of the Missal a few years ago. How high should it be because it's worthy of God? But how low should it be so that people understand it? And how do you find that middle ground? So architecture and rhetoric, architecture and language go very closely hand in hand. So since you all have the cheat sheet, I'll point to one more thing. At the bottom of the front side, it says decoration versus ornament. But ornament is something a little different. Ornament reveals purpose or function or clarifies use or indicates festivity. So there's different ways to enrich a building, but one of them is to put something on the building that tells you what the building is. So you see golden arches over a restaurant and you know there's pizza inside, right? No, there's hamburgers inside. Bam, you see a cross on the top of a tall steeple, you know it's a church. And if you saw a cross over a building and it was McDonald's inside, you'd be confused, right? You expect a correspondence between ornament and building use. And modernism as an architectural movement was anti-ornament for all various reasons, and so you see buildings that kind of all look the same. The church looks like the school, looks like the office park, looks like the shopping mall. That's the flattening out of hierarchies. So you will get a family coat of arms that is small. You can have a smiling mask, that's very easy. SPQR for you. Anybody know what SPQR means in the Roman tradition?
Senate.
Yeah, Senatus Populusque Romanum. The Senate and the people of Rome means the government built it. Latin inscription with a saint's name, it's very easy. Family coat of arms that's big, and sorry, you get nothing. Now, family coat of arms, what's your immediate thought about someone puts their family name or coat of arms on the building?
They were the patrons.
They're what?
They were the patrons?
They're the patron, or they're full of themselves, right? That's our motto here, right? I put Trump Tower, right? 40-foot letters. No, in the ancient world, it was a little different because the people who had wealth were expected to take care of the people who didn't. They didn't have government programs and all that. So if you visit Florence, you'll see there's a palace of the Medicis, and there's a big bench outside the door. And all the people would come and sit on the bench and wait to talk to the Medicis because they were illiterate, or if they were widows, they couldn't speak in court. They needed their patron, you know, Godfather, come help me, right? This is where the whole Godfather story comes from, where you go and talk to Don Corleone, and he has to talk to somebody for you. And so you had to know which neighborhood was your patron. So the Medicis governed one neighborhood in Florence, the Riccioli governed another one. And if you couldn't read, you had to know the family coat of arms, and you needed to know where you should go. So, oh, they're listening, just put something up there. And so a big family coat of arms wasn't, look at me, I'm so important. It was, I've done my duty to the city that a rich person is supposed to do. Okay, so let's see what we've got here. Family coat of arms, small on the private dwelling? How come? How come not? Private dwelling, you're not really an important family. No one's going to come to you to speak in court if you don't have any authority. Where would it go? Yes, there you go. So the regia is the place where someone who has authority resides. Now, we often think that the government builds the regias, but actually in the ancient world, or in the mid-Renaissance world, it was the rich guy or rich gal who built their own palace. And so the government wouldn't have done that. But what they might have done was built the market. And then the private dwelling gets nothing because nobody needs to know there except the person, nobody needs to go there except the person who lives there, and they know where it is, so they don't have to find it. The smiling mask is straightforward, but you see how this tells you what the thing is just by putting it on there. But now we have the coat of arms question. Little one versus a big one. Would you put a big coat of arms on a church? Well, why would you put a coat of arms on a church at all?
It's a plaque. Yeah. So-and-so gave this kneeler.
Yeah, so-and-so did his or her duty to society, paid to build this church. And I don't know if you're ever scandalized, you look at St. Peter's Basilica and it says, Farnesius, whoever, Cardinal, whoever, right on front over the door. It doesn't say St. Peter, it says some guy. But that's important. The Pope's job is to build up the mystical body. And if the Pope doesn't build up the mystical body, the Pope is not doing the job. And so we think of it as a megalomaniacal statement. They thought of it as evidence to the world that they were doing what they were doing. So, but to have it a little modest, they'd say, on the church, we have a little coat of arms. But on the palace, you have to find this guy. So you have to know where the thing is in the city. And so there it would be. Coats of arms now don't really mean anything. Yeah?
So was it frowned upon to do something anonymously then?
Not necessarily. That would have been considered a sort of extreme modesty, I suppose. That wouldn't be bad. It would just be not what's the expected convention. You know, I had a teacher who used to teach here. When I was at the University of Virginia. He was there, but then he came to Notre Dame. And he had us write papers on popes who didn't build anything. And I was like, how can you write an architecture paper on people who didn't build anything? But he said the art historical methodology is the new thing, the new thing, the new thing. So-and-so invented this, such and such invented that. What about the people who didn't invent anything? So I wrote a paper on Pius V. He was the Dominican, he was a reformer, he was living simply. He didn't build any great churches. What did he build? He built homes for prostitutes who wanted to come back to normal mainstream society. He built little things. And so this relationship between theology, social concern, and architecture is very often less sort of famous and interesting. So don't put your name on it. That's a real thing. You know, Pius V might have done something like that. He was a Dominican friar, had vows of poverty even as Pope. And so there's always room for this wide expression. But this would have been sort of the mainstream norm, which we've either used or departed from in some way. Yeah?
We may not use coat of arms, but we have Denis Hall, and we
Right.
have Malloy family, and
Yes.
it's like names everywhere. Where
Right.
it used to be, Soren named after somebody who did something.
Right, St. Joseph Hall, and
Yeah,
then
or
there'd be a
Saint-
plaque in the corner given by
Saint
so-and-so.
Peter, yeah.
And it also used to just say Smith Hall. Now it says Lois Q and Bill W and Children Hall, right? You gotta get everybody in there. But that's the fundraising thing, that what does the society want? We want all of our grandkids on the plaque over the door instead of the kind of humility, that you're asking about. Nothing wrong with that, it's just different societal conventions work in different ways. Right, Trump Tower is big giant letters on the thing. But that happens in, the Chicago Tribune has a big thing, so it's commercial, it's marketing. This is what Ornament does, whether it's, out of someone's ego or not. It reveals to you what the building is. And that's part of clarification of its purpose. And I heard you had some people talking about beauty before, and I'm not sure how they defined it, but in the Thomistic system, we call a thing beautiful, do you remember, Jeremy? We took this class 2 years ago. We call a thing beautiful when it reveals its ontological reality. And ontology is the study of being, or the nature of things. Ontos in Greek is being. So if I look like a giraffe, you would say, why is that guy dressed up like a giraffe? Something's not right. Is he weird? What's going on? I don't know. Is it a giraffe? Is it a person? All of a sudden, you don't know what you're encountering. But when you see a cross on a church that looks like a church, you say, oh, there's a church. But if you've ever been in a church that doesn't look like a church, and you see the sign that says so-and-so Catholic Church, you're like, really? That's the church? It doesn't look like a church. The sign says church. And instead of just resting in the theological knowledge of what's being sacramentally revealed to you, you're left in the darkness of the fall, which is, I don't understand. Understanding as God understands is life of grace. Not understanding is a result of the fall. So the increase in clarity is a contribution to beauty. And all these things are part of it. So it's a pre-existing reality. What if you were Stalin? How would you rearrange these buildings? So the Russian Revolution happens. What do?
Russia won.
They knock down the churches, right? And they make the palace of the Soviets, right? But even though they're supposed to be all about the poor, they don't really give nice housing to the poor. They make these industrial housing blocks that are sort of demeaning to come-day life.
Actually, they make the church into the governing spot. Right?
But-
They take the churches and make them into the governing spot.
Oh yeah, they transform them, or they knock them down, or whatever it happens to be. So you see the power of the secular authority rises to the top. So there's just different ways to think about all this as you consider the political system and
In some places, they just get rid of the theaters too. Like in Poland, they don't want them having that.
Right. There's the famous, I forget what it's called, maybe you know, they asked all the intellectuals and the artists and the poets to some retreat, and then they murdered them all in Poland because they wanted to cut off the university professors' heads.
Catching force, they murdered
Yeah.
the English.
It's an amazing and gruesome story, but they thought if the culture dies, then the people will be demoralized. This is why John Paul was always talking about poetry and plays and culture, keeping the Polish song.
It's the same thing in China.
Yeah, and China's not bringing its culture back a little bit, but they had the cultural revolution.
Cultural revolution.
Right. Okay, so what I want to do now, you have all finished your job very well. Thank you. I'm going to look at some real, honest-to-God cities and see what's what. That's right. Oops, wrong. And I think you'll be amazed at how quickly you can learn and have learned how to read a city. So we're just going to look at, in the time we have, look at Florence and Rome. Knowing what you know about building types, can you read some of these buildings already? What building type is this down here?
Housing.
Yeah, that's the domus, right? They're kind of piled on top of each other. How about this one with the dome? It's a church, but the dome tells you it's also,
Government.
well, we think of it as a government now, but before it,
Episode?
it's a tolos, right? It's a round place of veneration. So the thing about a tolos is it's a centralized plan. Usually it's a circle, but it could be a square. It could also be a Greek cross. Greek cross is a cross in the shape of a plus sign. So if you think about it, it could be this way. But typically it's round. And the thing about something that's round is the center is equidistant from every other point in the place. It's the only common point no matter where you are. And so it naturally draws attention to the center. They argued that they came from burial mounds in the ancient world. They'd bury somebody and then they'd pile soil on top. And then that became the place of veneration of someone important who was buried. Now it used a government building because U.S. Capitol, right? The dome was the tolos, exclusively religious, until the Enlightenment, and they said, we don't worship God, we don't venerate relics. What do? We venerate the political process. We put it over the government buildings. And so they stole the tolos and brought it to the secular use. In fact, the original U.S. Capitol was supposed to have George Washington's tomb under the dome, and they didn't build him, they didn't bury him there, but it was going to be a big tolos over the place of veneration of George Washington. All right, let's see, is this working? Not working, I can do it this way though. Huh. Oh, there we go. Well, can you read this city? This is an ancient Roman city in ruins, as you can tell. It's Timgad, it's Algeria from the 2nd century. What's the most important road in this city? This one, right? Right through. And then by going in the Triumphal Arch, you are sacramentalizing the importance of becoming urbane, right? So people out in the city, out in the country were farmers. They were, if you were a criminal, they didn't let you in the city. They buried the dead outside the city. But if you went in the city, you were a citizen, theoretically, and you had certain rights and privileges, and to go in there was important. And you can see on the other side of it, maybe you can see there's columns that run along the city road, and because that street is more important. And then there's secondary streets. What kind of building is this?
Stadium?
Well,
The stadium's in the back.
yeah, you can see the theater all the way up there at the top. That's the classic amphitheater built into the hill. This is actually a temple, right? A gathering for a celebration of worship. And then lots of little domus buildings here. Boom, 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 right? And there's a little forum up at the top there. There'll be different kinds of buildings, taberna, the shops, and so on. So you have like 5 minutes or 30 minutes of reading buildings, and suddenly it becomes crystal clear if your city is built in a way that can be readable. All right, how about this one? We just looked at that on the front screen. Okay, what kind of building types are these primarily? Right on the first floor, that's a taberna, the shops, right? And then what's above them? Right, so you can see the buildings can join together. They can be more than one thing at a time. And you know, this building looks kind of important, but something's over there. See that doorway on that building? Something's more important there. This is an enrichment that tells you that door is really important, and whatever's on the other side of that door better be as important as that door looks, or it's going to fool you. How about the famous Pantheon? What building type? Telos, right. It's a big, domed, centralized plan, round building. There's still lots of conjecture about what it was actually used for, but it's the Telos type, so that's already a way to try to think about it. Okay, there's the what there. Right across from the Pantheon. There's Mitanos, right? What kind of building is that? That's the Uber Taberna, right? It's the shop of shops. And when you go to Rome, you always find all the Americans in there because they're dying for a big Coke with ice in it. And, they know how to order everything. You don't have to wait a half hour to get your bill from the waiter. And so there it is. It's in the palace building, but it's a shop. And then you see more taberna things here with more domus buildings above. And one thing about traditional cities is that streets are not roads. It's an interesting distinction. We don't build streets most of the time. We build roads. Roads are how you get from here to there and you drive really fast. Pedestrians are not welcome. They get hit if they try to cross the 12 lanes of traffic. Streets are considered outdoor rooms where you can live and walk around and have festivals and sit outside and have a drink and eat dinner. So the political life can actually happen in the streets of a city compared to the roads of a suburb. And so there's a whole movement now, a lot of it's centered, in fact, here at the Notre Dame School of Architecture called New Urbanism. Have you walked around the Eddy Commons area at all? Just over there? That used to be kind of a nothing. And then they made narrow streets, tall buildings, shops on the bottom, apartments on the top, and condos on the top. And if you go a few blocks, you start to see that these new houses that are built very close together. The porches all line up so the neighbors can see each other. The garages are in the back on alleys so that you can drive in and leave your car there, and you don't have a driveway, but you actually have a house that comes up to the street. So when people walk along the sidewalk, you say, oh, hey, how's it going? At least ideally, you know. It's probably not possible if everybody's out at work all day. But if you're going to be home, the isolation of suburbia is considered a sort of the death to community. And so urbanism is about community and extension of the Christian mission. Okay, what building type is this? This is the plan. This is the entry. This is a courtyard right there. Open to the sky. It's the Regia, right. The sort of unofficial plan for the, unofficial term for the Regia is the square donut. So if you look at the plan there, it's open in the middle and it has rooms all the way around. And so it's Regia, often 3 stories high. And then you have to know sort of whose Regia it is. It's Palazzo Farnese in Rome. And you can see that big coat of arms over the door. It has these little fleur-de-lis on it. And that was the Farnese family coat of arms. And so if you had a big palace, that meant you're an important person. Several of the Farneses were popes, cardinals, and they would establish their place in the hierarchy of the city and build certain buildings. If you built 4-story palace, you were really at the top of the heap. Only one person in the whole city of Rome could build a 5-story palace. Do you know who it is? The Pope, right? So when he throws the thing out there, and you look up at the palace where, at least where the popes lived until Francis, there's a 5-story palace. And if you built a 5-story palace in Renaissance Rome, you were committing treason because you were saying my authority is higher than the Pope. And that's how people read architecture, at least the people who knew architecture. Yeah.
So in that floor plan, where would the royal family live?
Well, the second floor was the principal floor, because the bottom floor had all the business and horses and people coming and going. So what they call the piano nobile, the sort of noble level, was up on the second floor, and that's where the big rooms would be. And then the servants would be on the third floor, because they had to climb all the steps, which the wealthy people didn't want to do. So they didn't want to hang around with the horses, and they didn't want to live on the third floor. So all the big rooms with the tall windows and the tall ceilings would be on the second floor. You often see that in older buildings. Like if you go to Chicago and you go to like the University Club or something, the first floor is people coming and going in bathrooms and check-in. The second floor is where the library and the dining hall is, or maybe it's up even higher, but it's usually not on the first floor like we might think. Okay, so here's some different coats of arms. If you could read coat of arms, you would know who's who. The Medici have these little balls on theirs, but what do you know about the Medici family based on the coat of arms? Or at least that particular member of the Medici family. He was a pope, right? So you have the keys of Peter and the papal tiara up there. The Farneses were also a papal family. You can see that up there. And then the Barbarinis are another papal family, and they had the 3 B's on their coat of arms. And so one of the Barbarini popes was, I think it was Urban VII, built the baldacchino over the altar at St. Peter's with those swirly bronze columns. And if you could get up close to it, you'll see the swirly bronze columns at the bottom are these leaves sort of growing out of the thing, and there's little bees flying around in it. Because it's not making a big giant bee on it, but it's saying the Barberini family built this. And the bee, has a long symbolic meaning because they make honey. The land of milk and honey is sweet, and there's the honey-mouthed preacher who speaks in a way that's delightful to listen to. They also make wax, and wax is for candles, and candles are for mass. Mass is for Eucharist, Eucharist is for salvations. God made bees so we could have salvation. This is this cosmic worldview that the created world is good. If you ever go to the Easter Vigil, there's the Exultet, we're talking about the bees, right? And in the last translation, they didn't have the bees in, and then people were saying, where are the bees? And the new translation, the bees came back. And it's funny to think of a bee worshiping, but they don't have this sort of free will like we have, but they have a will, right? And their will is to go to flowers, make honey, make wax, and by doing that, they're obeying God's plan. The stars move in orbits, that's doing God's plan. And so this sort of natural things come up, and although it looks funny, have bugs on there, there they are. Okay, can you do a little reading of this street in Florence? I just like to ask you the same thing over and over, so if you feel silly saying the same thing over and over, just say it anyway. What kind of buildings are these?
Regia.
Sorry,
Yeah, Regia.
They could be Regias, or they could be some highfalutin domus buildings right on top of each other. As the 18th, 19th century came along, the private buildings started to look more and more like Regias, the sort of higher architecture. But earlier on, they would have been much simpler. And then look what's over here. What do we have? Right? So there's something venerated under there. And then you have a little temple in front here. But what's interesting about the placement of this church? Why isn't it over there like it should be? So you can see it from a distance, right? So you look down the street and you say, oh, there's my parish church. I know exactly where to go. And so the important things are not only distinguished by their shape or the material. You can see where this is kind of stucco with some uninteresting stone, and then the higher quality stone is here. But also it can be seen from a distance. So cities are planned so that at the end of long axes you put an important thing, so that in a sense it dominates the cityscape and also gives clarity to the city, where to go. If you've been to Rome and seen all those obelisks that are all over the place, there's a big one in front of St. Peter's. That actually came about when they were reorganizing the city streets in the Renaissance, and they put them in different places so people would always know where they were, near the major basilicas, and they actually knocked down buildings and rerouted streets, and so you could see the basilicas and get to them, and the pilgrims could find them more easily, and it was a way of organizing the city around the theological realities. So we talked about columns before, and these are those images of Doric. And Tuscan is actually the one at the very top. It's relatively even more simple than the Doric. And then Ionic comes in lots of different kinds. Sometimes the scrolls are bent at angles. They're called scamozzi Ionic. Sometimes they're flat across, called Greek Ionic. And they're more like species than they are like examples. So if you think this is a whole group of dogs here, say, you have the Tuscan is a German Shepherd, and the Ionic is a Collie. And then within each Collie, you can have 100 different Collies. And so you have this type of Ionic. But then it can be lots and lots and lots of variety. Here's your composite with the scrolls and the leaves of that. And they come all through history. So, knowing what you know about buildings, hierarchies, columns, materials, size, siding. What can you say about this church? And it says, if somebody, Episcopus Studentinus Fecit, made it, right? Bishop somebody made it, right on the front over the door. So we know why. Is it a high in the hierarchy of buildings or low?
Pretty high.
Pretty high. How do you know? It's tall. Got a cross on top that tells you it's a church.
And the columns are decorated.
The columns are which type?
I can't.
They're Corinthian, actually, Corinthian.
Yeah.
But that's pretty darn high. So that's, it's the second highest. It means you're not competing with St. Peter's, but you're still pretty high up there. Plus it's got statues and sculpture of different kinds. Columns also come in all kinds of hierarchies. The bigger they are, the higher they are in hierarchy. The more of them there are, the more it indicates the importance of the building. Also, the more they're freestanding, that means you can get your arms around them, the more elevated they are. So you see this is a flat column here, it's called a pilaster. It's actually considered a square column that's embedded into the wall, and you only see the first couple of inches. And then see how they become like a half column here. And the center, being more important than the edge, gets a column that's more important than the ones on the edge. So if you like this kind of thing, like if you have a really precise mind, you like Thomistic theology and Aristotelian logic and flow charts and this to that and chapters of contents and table of contents, this is your game. If you just like a feeling the church should make me feel good, this is not your game, right? There's different kinds of temperaments in the world, but this is a very precise way of specifying the intellectual construct in the city. And then this was the place where the priests lived. How do you know it's less important than the other one? What building type does it look like?
Reggio.
It's a Reggio with some funky stuff on the roof, right? A different material, not the stone. The columns are smaller, and it definitely plays second fiddle to this building. So God and public worship is more important than this residence, which is also important, but not as important as that one. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting that you say if you're a temperament that's kind of free-flowing and I like to feel good or whatever, I kind of think I'm sort of like that.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was in Rome, I lived there for 3 years, I didn't know all of these rules, and yet I intuited when I was in places, there was a grandeur and a sense of transcendence, and that was just, it was awe-inspiring. And there was a sense that you kind of could feel your way through the streets in a way that, like, especially, I mean, the eastern United States has cities that are on grids and everything, and you can find your way. But once you go to other places, it's like it doesn't make, then you get lost all the time.
Yep.
Before Google Maps, you can, I got lost in Rome a lot too, but I'm just saying, so you can intuit it, even if you don't know all this language.
And it's not, I present it as a bit of an either or, but it's not really that. Because, as you said, you might not know all these rules, but you say, well, something important's over there, it's big and it's white marble, and well, let me go see what that is. It looks like a church. And you don't have to know how to precisely do everything. I try to argue that a building should work on that level, right? Whoa, that's cool. And then, not only is it cool, it's actually right. So when I kick my brain in and I say, is this more important than that? Yeah, everything about the building feels right and actually lives up to close intellectual inspection. And so you can have your feelings and your intellect too. Yeah.
Well, and you can't, it's not good, if you designed a building saying, I just want it to feel right, you've got to think about the details and all that, so they both feed into each other.
Exactly. So you should be intellectually satisfied when you investigate something. So if you go to Mass and it's beautiful and you have a wonderful experience, but the priest has not done the right matter and form, well, it feels great, but fails the intellectual test, right, for valid administration of the sacrament. So these two things have to go together. However, if it's just a strict box, Thomistic exercise, and it's not a person in front of you, but a theological case study, and then that's not enough either, right? So they have to always work together. I tell people it should work at the level of, dear Grandma, I'm in Rome. I wish you were here to see these pretty churches, right? And then it works at, dear Grandma, I just learned about columns and what they mean in hierarchies, and then that works too. And then this building is different from other churches, and it has different specificity and so on, and it looks very Roman. Not every church has to look like Rome, but this is the Roman way. So the Notre Dame way is this kind of beigey brick and the collegiate Gothic, and when you do that, you're in your local place. New England does its red brick and whatever. Santa Barbara has its mission style stucco, and so there's local varieties. But are you from Santa Barbara?
I'm from Southern California.
Okay, right. It's a local vernacular of a language. Even if you speak French, German, Chinese, Latin, Greek, whatever, you have high words and low words. You have elevated language, you have slang, you have important things and less important things. And so you can have all the local variety you want, but they all push to the same theological reality. And this is like the true basis for enculturation, is that certain cultures may not have X, Y, and Z that ancient Rome had, but they preserved something really important that ancient Rome didn't. And then when all those cultures come together, they sort of put the whole piece, all the pieces form the whole. But let's see. Okay, here's good old St. Peter's. What do you know about it? What does it look like? Does it look like a church? Looks more like a regia. How come? It's the authority resides here, right? The authority of the successor of Peter. And so it's got a kind of palace-y front to it. Originally, they built some towers on each side, and they fell down from structural problems. They took them down. They took one down and started to crack. And so it doesn't really look like a church so much as a wide, long palace. But then you can see the dome on top, and the dome is the tolos. Why is there a big tolos there? What's under that dome? St. Peter. There's an altar, and under that are the bones of Peter. Veneration. So this is not the Cathedral of Rome, as you probably know. It's a shrine church for St. Peter. And so although the Pope is associated with it, it's not the Pope's cathedral church. But it's the biggest one, nonetheless. And they're trying to say, hey, all you Protestants up north who don't believe in Peter, and the successor of Peter, we'll show you how Peter we can be, right? So, can you interpret this nice fountain here? This is in the Vatican. You can go there and drink the water coming out of it. Who's providing this water for you? It's not SPQR, right? It's the successor of SPQR, which is Pope. And so he has a triple tiara, which signifies his triple authority as the head of the Church of Rome, head of the entire church, and then the head of the papal states. And so the keys associated with the scripture references, I give you these keys, and what you bind in heaven will be bound in heaven, and so on. And then the papal scarab. So I'm the Pope. My job is to make sure that the regular folks can have water, and here they go. It's kind of fun. There's two ways to argue this. You can sort of do the Marxist interpretation of the Pope's telling poor people he's the boss, right? Or you can say the Pope is a guy who loves his people and wants to make sure that he does stay hydrated. Right. So I'll let you decide which interpretive lens you like to use. Okay, so I found this online. I don't know who that young woman is, but she's been in some presentations for many years now. Is this an important city gate? It's probably on the edge somewhere. How do you know? Yeah, it's largely brick, and then there's a little bit of stone and the trim here, and there's something on the other side. Probably the city grew outside the walls over time. So there's a very little bit of marble, but it's still pretty significant. I mean, if you had to build this in your backyard, it would bankrupt you probably. It's a serious thing. How would you compare it to this? Is this an important city gate?
Yes.
Pretty much, although for a really important city gate, it'd probably be marble here too, and here. But something's important about this entry versus this one. It's bigger, it's got stone on it, it's got an inscription, it's got somebody's coat of arms on the top. So who built this? I don't know. Maybe there was a threat of some invading army and whoever was in charge trying to build this strong gate. It looks stronger than it is, actually, because these big blocks of stone are here. It doesn't make the building any stronger, but it makes it look stronger, and that's called rustication. So it's the clarifying of the appearance of strength. And you see all these little moves in and out, and all these shadows that they cast, and there's a face and the keystone and everything. So it's an important gate. It's enriched that way. All right, what else have we got here? All right, how about this gate?
Pretty wow.
Pretty wow, yeah. So if you have a oh moment, which I just heard in the room, then you say it's important. Then you say, does it live up to its importance? These are people down here, so you can see how big it is. Arch of Constantine. So if you know the story of Constantine, he's the early 4th century emperor, and he has some level of conversion to Christianity. But the story is that he has to go out and duel with his rival for the emperorship, Maxentius, and there's this famous Battle of Milvian Bridge. I think it's the 310. 312. 312, okay.
October 28th.
Oh, you got a Roman historian right here. Anyway, he wins, right? So he comes back to Rome, and he wins. Hey, I'm the new emperor. And they're like, oh, good, we just heard this because you just got back. Go govern for a while, and when we're done, when we're ready, we're going to have a big feast called the Triumph. And then you can ceremonially enter the city through this gate, and we'll hail you as the emperor and so on. So it's a really important gate here. The columns have kind of worn away over the years, but can you see what column types they are? Yeah, they're actually Corinthian, but a lot of leaves have fallen off, so it's hard to see. You can sort of see it over on this one. This is the case of Constantine using the Corinthian for his own projects, which no emperor had done in recent memory. And there's no letter from Constantine saying, I gave the composite to Jesus. There's just buildings built by Constantine about himself that are Corinthian and churches that are composite. And so there's speculation that that's what he did. So entering the city, the triumphant victor enters the city, and people follow behind. Anything? You ever do anything like that yourself? Sunday morning at 10:30? Who's the real triumph over sin and death? It's Christ, the new victor. What is the entry to a church? It's all oftentimes little door, big door, little door. You're following Christ, who's the true victor, and you're entering into the new city, which is the heavenly Jerusalem, which the church totally sacramentalizes. So they took the triumphal arch as a convention into the front of a church building. How about good old this? You know what this is, a Trevi fountain? You have to go throw coins over your shoulder and eat gelato over there and then sit around and look. What is a fountain? Gosh, what building type is that? We don't really know, but what does it look like? It is a regia, right. Now, this part of Rome was considered very poor, very ugly, and it was a project of one of the popes, and if you know the Pope's coat of arms up there, you can tell exactly what it was. It actually says Clement XII on the inscription, and he wanted to beautify the city of this part of the city, so it was a project of the Pope. And so he made it look kind of like a regia, which is his place of authority. Then this starts to look like a triumphal arch. A little arch, big arch, little arch. This is Neptune, who's in charge of water. So water is triumphantly entering into the city. This very important looking building with its Corinthian columns and a lot of them. And all these stones are actually made of marble too. They're carved to look like naturally occurring stones, but they're not. And so it's a wonderful thing. It's just like whipped cream on the ice cream, on the cherry on top. Is it the highest, sort of most important thing in the city? No, but here's this delightful thing. Poor people, I'm going to bring you clean water, and it's not just going to be a pipe sticking out of the wall. It's going to be this wonderful, delightful thing that people will come, see for the next however many centuries. All right, so let's look at Florence a little bit. Go ahead and read the city for me. Yeah, here's the Duomo, the cathedral. This kind of square area here was the original Roman city. So they would make a crossroads and then they put walls around it. They'd make a street grid. And then the city eventually grows. The Christians came later, so they had to find room where they could. So this is the original center of the Roman town. That's where all the shops are. And the church had to find land where it could later on, so they're off to the edge. So you could argue that this is a decorum problem, right? The most important things are not in the most important place, but it's the way that history works. Then you see most of the city is domus buildings for the most part. Occasionally you get a church, which would be templum, and then you have the little regia where the priests and the monks live, because that's a place of the presiding authority. There's a few little important domes here and there, that big white one right next to the church. Anybody know what that is? The baptistry. What building type is that? It's a tolos. How come?
Because you die.
You die, right? In your baptism, you go into death, rise again in new life. It's a place of veneration. In the Christian Renaissance, it was also the place where you became a citizen, because you had to take an oath in the name of Jesus Christ to uphold the laws of Florence. So you couldn't be a citizen unless you were baptized. It wasn't like a religious, exclusionary thing, but how could they trust you if you wouldn't stake your eternal soul on your willingness to follow the law? So it had a lot of importance in the city. And you can see the Duomo has a dome, and then also the templum in front of it, so it's a Tolos combination. You can also see another Tolos right up there. That's the Medici family burial tombs. Santa Maria Novella over there, if you've been to Florence, near the train station, that's a templum. And templum doesn't mean temple like ancient temple, it's the sort of Latin word for sort of a place of worship. So you can use the word templum for a church if you're using Latin. Okay, so you are very articulate readers of cities now. The Christian vision extended across the landscape. What's this? Building types? Yeah, could be Tiberia on the bottom, the domus on the top. This one looks a little more like a regia. People want the nice real estate along the river. There's your Tolos, there's your templum, there's another Tolos, that's the Medici tomb. And then over here is at the big regia of the city. It's called the Palazzo Vecchio. It's the city hall, basically. And so it's made of that rough brown stone, which is why I picked that before. So there it is. And this became the model for the palace. In Florence in particular, it's brown stone, 3 levels, and then they added that kind of fortification on the top. And you can see it's a regia, but it's not a very regular regia. So this kind of late medieval architecture, and the Renaissance architects thought disorder is not really the result of the transformation in Christ. Order is. And so they started trying to perfect things with geometry and number and mathematics. All right, tell me all you know about this. Well, I don't show Medici, but you know, even if I didn't put the label on because of that coat of arms with the balls on it. Serious building, important people in the city? Yeah, Medici's. They're the #1 merchant/wealthy family, and their building looks like it. They don't have to have taberna on the first floor because they're rich enough to eat the cost of that space. So a lesser person would, a lesser wealthy person would have shops there. And then the bottom looks really strong because it has to hold up all the stuff on the top. It has to keep out bad guys. It's not really stronger than the stuff above it, but because it's rusticated, it looks like it is. And they even tell you by carving little ribbons. See where that coat of arms is hanging? The little ribbons flying out to the side. It's as if you hung a picture on a nail. It's not part of the building, but it actually appears to be hanging on the building. That's the nature of ornament. And it's not structural, but it looks like the building is holding it up. And there's the front door you can see through to the courtyard. And then the inside, that's the classic square donut of the Italian palace method. All right, tell me all about this one. So I don't really know that loud. The facade is 1470 in part, so it's early Renaissance. But you know what building type it is?
Temple.
It's the templum. But does the bottom half look like anything to you? Yeah, little arch, big arch, little arch, and then this area here called the attic story. And then there's a little temple on top of it. So take your little Greek temple, stick it on top of a triumphal arch, and you have the double meaning of the triumphal entry to the city. That's also a place of worship. All that stripy stuff, well, it looks important. It's different colors of marble. It's the Tuscany's regional way of making buildings. If you see Siena and a lot of the cathedrals in this area, they like this stripy white and green or white and black marble. What kind of column types here? What kind of columns, I should say? Corinthian, right. Important building. And so this was pretty early in rediscovering the grammar of architecture. There's the plan of the whole thing. So here's the entry to the church. And then you see the various courtyards, the regia of the authority that resides there. And there's the sort of my ham-fisted way to show you how they thought about this. Take a temple, stick it on top of a triumphal arch. And so that it doesn't look like it's going to fall over, you put these little volume things, they're called volumes, but they're like bookends, right? They hold it in from wanting to fly out sideways. These were invented by this architect. They had never been invented before. And so it's as new as this date and as kind of old as the nature of things. There's something in architecture called lateral thrust, which is buildings like to fly outward. You think that if a building's tall, it's going to fall down, but it doesn't fall down. If you watch where my knuckles go and it comes out, see they move outward. So downward force tends to push out. So what they want to do is push it back in. And it's not literally pushing it back in, because it's only that thick of marble, but it looks like it's as strong as it needs to be to do what it looks like it's doing, even if it's not doing that. And so in architecture, like in poetry, one of the things about poetic things is that the facts are distorted to make the truth more evident. The facts are distorted to make the truth more evident, which runs counter-intuition to us. But the example I like to use is, I should pick on Jeremy. Did you do some romantic proposal to Genevieve when you asked her to marry you? Or did she ask you to marry her?
I asked her, yeah.
You asked her, okay. Did you say, Genevieve, you've got good DNA, I've got good DNA, we should perpetuate the species? What do you do in poetic representation? You say, you are the fairest rose among all the roses. And if you're marrying a rose, literally, like there's an issue there, right? When you said yes to me, I was a gazelle leaping across the stars. There were diamonds in your eyes. There's diamonds in your eyes? Like emergency room time, right? So facts are distorted to make the truth more evident. You know, if you say you're my queen to your wife, well, that's nice. It means you love her so much you want to please her more than yourself. If she's actually your queen, then that's a different story. So facts and truth are in poetic representation, that is factually not holding up the building. But in truth, it's doing what it should be doing if it were actually doing what it looks like it's doing. But you see it there in detail. You see the name up there in that horizontal part there. It's a little hard to read because it's washed out, but it says Rucellai. The Rucellai were one of the other regional families of Florence with the Medicis who who are in charge of that area of town. And it's a little hard to see here. Let me see if it shows up in the next one. That's a little bit better, a little clearer. And that little baby in the sun at the top, that was the neighborhood symbol of that part of Florence. So it's a church, it's universal in a sense, it's Tuscan by its materials, but then it's local. It's got this guy's name on it and that regional part of the city logo. And there you can see their coat of arms over the arch, but very little, the zigzaggy thing, the ribbons flying around. Can you make out what's going on in that blue and white part above? There's this curved thing with all these ropes flying around. Can you guess what the business?
Sail.
There is sail. Yeah, it's a sail from a sailing ship, but the ship's not there. So the wind is blowing the sail this way, and all the ropes that would have tied it to the mast are flying around. The ritualized were shipping people. That's how they made their money. So it's saying delightful, interesting, but ritualized, specificity, universality, all working together using this kind of much wider classical language, and then telling you it's the church by the Dominicans, because it's still run by the Dominicans, the famous Dominican church in Florence.
Dennis,
Yeah.
you described this, but I don't know if you actually defined it, but the difference between decoration and ornament.
Yeah, well, we didn't talk about decoration too much here, but I
described
will,
it very
since you
well.
brought it up. Okay.
You described it very well already.
Well, thank you. There are two ways to enrich a building. One is ornament, and that tells you about the purpose or the use, or indicates festivity. That's a really important one. So all these little plants that are on here, and ribbons and all that, if this, now you have to concentrate on this, because it's a very complicated theory of ritual studies. Here it is. When you want to indicate festivity, do you remember, Jerry?
Stuff on stuff.
You hang stuff on stuff. That's the rule. Okay? So when it's Christmas, you put lights on your gutters. Isn't it weird, right? When it's your birthday, you put fire on a cake and put it in front of a 3-year-old. That's kind of funny. When it's Halloween, you put pumpkins outside. You hang stuff on stuff. When it's your wedding day, you have stuff on you that you don't wear any other day, because that's a high day of festivity compared to go to work. If you know Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, you know Miss Havisham gets jilted at the altar and she never takes her wedding dress off. She's like 80 years old, she's still wearing her wedding dress because she's mad, whatever. You don't wear your wedding dress if it's not your wedding, right? And in fact, the wedding day, it was only like 12 hours. You buy a $10,000 dress for 12 hours, but that day is so important that you hang all kinds of stuff on stuff. And so that's ornament. It reveals that it's your wedding, it reveals who you are, it reveals how you're using whatever, and it reveals festivity. Decoration is something else. That's the clarification of structure. So in the logic of structure, the world is basically, in the Aristotelian worldview, is made up of horizontals and verticals. So if you think of the ground as the great horizontal, it kind of moves that way. The up and down of a column moves that way, up and down, and they'll support a beam that goes horizontally like that. And sometimes you have diagonals. Sometimes you have circular movement too, but that doesn't usually happen in architecture. So the idea is wherever a horizontal meets a vertical, something happens there to show you that it's enriched. And it usually happens in a way that gradually transitions from vertical to horizontal. So see, this beam here is a horizontal. This column is a vertical. And look what happens right here. That little curve takes your eye right over there. Boom. So if you like to look at Victorian houses and you see the porches and they have these brackets going this way, or if you paid $1,000 to have crown molding in your living room, it's the same thing. The vertical of the wall gradually transitions to the ceiling of your living room with that crown molding. And so that's what separates a column from a pole, for instance. A pole is just a pole crashed into the ground, crashed into the ceiling, and that's it. A column has this graceful representation of the transition from horizontal to vertical. In fact, at the bottom of a column, you'll often see a bunch of moldings that look like this. They go around like that. That's the same thing. That's transitioning from vertical to the ground. Or it's like your feet. You know, if you walked around on your ankles, it'd be very abrupt crashing to the ground because your feet go like this and you can bounce on them. It gives it a kind of springy lightness. And then what does a ballet dancer do? Bam, right? Completely changes the proportions of the body and makes it look effortless. And that's actually, if I remember right, the origin of ballet. They were trying to figure out what would eschatological human movement look like, where gravity didn't keep you from holding a woman over your head with one arm up on your toes, and making it look effortless, even though it's a lot of work. So the Olympic weightlifters pick up 750 pounds when they have their bellies and the veins are bulging. Boom, they throw it down, right? That's not what a ballet dancer does. A ballet dancer makes it look effortless. And that's what classical architecture is supposed to do, but always with clarity of structure. Vertical meets horizontal, then this thing supports this thing, comes all the way around the other side, it lands on something, that something is supported by something, and it's all believable if it were actually structural, but it's poetic. It represents how things would work. So if you see a building, now you can make any building do anything you want with steel, and if it's all in different angles, and it's structurally illogical. But one of the things about classical and traditional architecture generally, even if it's not structurally literal, it has to be presented as if it could work if it was doing what it looks like it's doing again. Because poetry has to correspond to the thing. So if you say to your bride, when you said yes to me, I was a slug going across the garden eating begonias. Well, that's not really great. It's poetic, but it's not true, right? I was a gazelle leaping across the stars. It has to correspond to what it is supposed to be making more true. So decoration clarifies structure, ornament clarifies use or indicates festivity. So here we go. Coat of arms right there, that's the Palazzo Rucellai. So we just looked at their church, which is Santa Maria Novella. This is their house, the same zigzaggy thing on it, and you can see the ribbons floating around, and you can see their sails up above, but much reduced. The material here is not that marble, it's kind of a duller gray stone. So it's them in their domestic realm or in their regia realm, and then there's them in their sacred realm as well. And the materials are different, and the building shapes are different. So here we go. How do you know what's winning the day in this building? In this picture. Height. Big, big thing. And you may have seen that little book called Brunelleschi's Dome a few years ago. It's a little popular book about building the dome on here. Brunelleschi was the architect who did it. And when they built the church, they finished it, except for the dome, like 200 years before they built the dome. Not because they didn't have the money, but because they didn't know how to do it. So they built a church with a big giant opening for a big giant dome that they knew they didn't have the technology to build. But they said, someday God will send us someone who does. And 200 years later, Filippo Brunelleschi comes along and figures it out. And then they've been waiting 200 years for the domes. It's like they're waiting for Christ in the Old Testament.
Was it
and the dome comes down, and then they have this big celebration. Yeah.
Was it open air, or did they put something over the top?
They probably had a temporary roof up there, keep the weather out. But they knew someday God would send them, and then there was a cause for celebration. So it's big. It's made of this Tuscan kind of colored marble, and then the tolos of the dome. Now this one's 8-sided. It's an octagon. Sometimes it's very hard to make circles. It's hard to put roofs on circles and everything. So sometimes they're made octagons just because it's easier. But you know the symbolism of the number 8 in relation to baptism? It's pretty common.
The 8th day.
The 8th day, right. So 6 days of creation, then God rests on the 7th day, and then the 8th day is the day beyond that. It's the day of eternity. And you get access to that through baptism. And so oftentimes baptistries will be octagonal. And after a while this becomes, he's asking the same question again. I'm just wearing you out to give you the same answer. But city street, regias of different kinds, domes of different kinds, streets that line up so that you can see the dome and the church in the right place. It's clearly readable. Material, size, location, relation to other buildings. And when you get to the side, clearly different from everything around it. And you can see where they didn't finish the marble, by the way, up under the roof of the dome. See how dull it looks? Someday, 200 years from now, they'll fill that in. They'll have a big celebration as well. And then the detail. Most of the covering of the cathedral is from the 19th century, actually, but they are doing it in the traditional Tuscan way. And there's the inside, quite plain, but also structurally logical. So this is where decoration comes in. So you have this rib, which is up in the ceiling, and so it bears the weight of the roof, and then it comes down and lands on this big horizontal, and then that is supported by this vertical. So this vertical comes up, and those ribs land on it, and it lands on the top, and it comes down on the other side. This arch lands on something horizontal, that something is supported by something vertical. Nothing floats in architecture, everything's in the right place. If this were steel, and you wanted to cover it up in traditional garb, you'd still have to do it the right way. It has to look like what it's doing, even if it's not doing what it looks like it's doing. Isn't that funny? But poetic stuff is funny like that. Jeremy was never a gazelle leaping across the stars, but Genevieve would be happy to know that he was. See something funny going on here on the floor? This is flat, but it's done in a way that makes it look like an optical illusion under the ladder. And so it looks like it'll fall off the end of the earth. You have to be in just the right place for it to do this. You don't get dizzy when you go there. But I was just talking to an architect named James McCurry who designed the brand new cathedral in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was dedicated 2 months ago. And it's a big classical building, it's got marble floors. And he did an optical illusion like this around the altar. So the altar is in the sanctuary, it's baldacchino over it, and all around it is marble of an optical illusion because he wanted you to know that when you walk up to an altar, you're leaving the predictable Cartesian space of this world, and you're entering into the place where space and time start to blend, where heaven and earth start to become indistinguishable from each other. And so it's a three-dimensional marble floor that has a theological importance and not just a gameplay. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the what looks like metal rods. Is that a structural reinforcement?
Yes, that's a tie rod, and it's iron, and they came later once the building started doing its outward thing. So if your building does an outward, you can do two things. You can push it over here, or you can hold it together in the middle, like that. So instead of pushing against it, it's called being in tension. It holds it in this way.
Do you know how long ago they had to start doing that?
Actually, I don't, but if it's iron, it's probably not sooner than well, I don't even want to speculate, but
Within this last century?
it's probably older. My guess is it's older than that. But see, the Italians like Gothic architecture sometimes, but they didn't like flying buttresses. There's a lot of discussion about this. They heard about this cool stuff going on in France, but they didn't like it to look French. They liked it to look Italian. And flying buttress holds the roof up, right? That's what it does. They didn't want that French stuff, so they told the architects, make it Gothic, but without those things the French do. And so the things that were holding up the roof weren't there, and they started going, right? So believe it, strangely enough, there's the building committee minutes from, I forget which cathedral, maybe it's Siena. They were all chronicled, meeting after meeting after meeting. They brought these architects in from France. They said, we like your French thing. We don't like that French stuff. And the French architects like, it's going to fall down if you don't do it. And every month they had these meetings. All the records are still there from like the 13th century. It's very interesting. They had the same problems building committees have now. So I think we're almost out of time here. So there's the view into the dome. And so maybe we'll just kind of finish with this, because remember, the theatrum is the place where you imagine things not as they are, but as they could be or should be. And basically the sacramental worldview is an imaginative worldview. Maybe you've heard about the Catholic imagination as a concept. And it doesn't mean that I like to write poems and I happen to go to church on Sunday, so I have a Catholic imagination. It doesn't really mean that. Imagination is the power of the soul and the mind to encounter, know, and understand things that are not actually in front of you, which is kind of amazing. This is a painting of Christ in glory and all the angels and saints and the souls rising at the end of time and so on. That's not literally in front of you. I mean, it's spiritually real, right? So the thing about liturgy is everything that you encounter liturgically is real if it's happening in heaven and it's intersecting with earth, but it's not sensate. You can't see it with your eyes or touch it with your hands or hear the angels around the throne of God. So what do you have to do? You have to have the choir sound like the angels singing around the throne of God. And then they help you sing that song around the throne of God as well. So this is where ontology really matters. If you think the choir is the hip kind of garage band that keeps the kids interested and they sing to you, it totally violated the idea of what a choir is, because a choir is never a second congregation that sings to the congregation. They either sing for the congregation or they help the congregation sing, but they're always directed toward the worship of God the Father. So when I work with people consulting on churches and they want to put the altar here and the choir here, looking at the people, like, nope, they're not a music group that doesn't worship. Put them over here. So they're looking at the altar too. And they have a position of leadership as a choir should have. If you're going to say, well, the church, the Mass is just our communal meal where we feel good with each other, well, yeah, hopefully that's true, except the bigger notion is you're supposed to imagine that you're assembling as the mystical body. It's very, very important. The gathering is one thing. If you pile a bunch of bricks out in front of a church, you've gathered them. If you assemble all the bricks into a building, you've assembled them. And so people assemble in the church rather than merely gather, and they gather as the mystical body of Christ. So, if you think about the body of Christ, and I always draw it like a tubby gingerbread man, so sorry about that. You have the Father up here in heaven, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they're doing their happy job of the circumcision of their life and love and self-gift. And Christ is there, right? He's happy there. But he joins us to himself as the members of the mystical body so that we can enter the dialogue of the Trinity, which is kind of amazing. Human beings can enter the dialogue of the Trinity. The question is, how do we unite ourselves to that headship that's in heaven? How do we become that? And so the notion of the mystical body is that the people on earth join themselves to the headship of Christ, and they sacramentally assemble into the body of Christ. The priest takes the job of the head, and the people take the membership of the body, and together they offer worship to God the Father. This is what the true active participation was about. It wasn't, well, if you're the minister of donuts, suddenly you feel welcome, right? There's something to that, but it's not very much. The notion was, I'm going to join my intentions to the intentions of the priest who's gathering them all up and offering them to the Father. And that happens in the context of the full mystical body, which includes the angels, the saints, our creation. And so you're imagining, hey, this isn't just an art history book picture. This is the actual liturgical reality that I'm encountering. That cross space, represented sacramentally in the eye. So here's the odd intro. Inside the church, you do all this stuff. Then you can extend it out across the cityscape and then across the nation and create Eucharistic space, as the title was given, but not so much as a big empty room where we happen to say Mass, but a tangible, encounterable, sacramental, incarnate, glorified vision of this. I am worthy of, even though I'm the toe, I'm part of the mystical body. Even though I'm the lungs, because I'm in the choir, I'm part of the mystical body. And it's not the self-enclosed circle cut off from the head. Hey, look at us. There's the belly button, aren't we great? It's all of us together at the head, offering, especially in the Eucharistic prayer, offering ourselves as a victim to God the Father, which is very funny. Victim language we don't like. But it's right there in Vatican II that Christ offers himself as a victim so that he can get himself glorified. We offer ourselves as victim, we get ourselves glorified. Victimhood is not destruction, it's glorification. No.
That leads me to something I've been thinking about this whole time, is the recent unpleasantness that is 60s and 70s church architecture, and worship in the round, and was that was that an attempt to move from the temple to the tholos, or was that an attempt to say that language, we're going to set that aside, we're going to try a new language, given the newness of Vatican II or whatnot? I mean, what?
Well, this is my take on it.
And why did it utterly fail? Thankfully.
Well, I think this is where ontology really matters. So if you think about the stereotypical 19th century church, and this is all the liturgical reformers were complaining, the priest was up there doing everything, mumbling in Latin in the low mass, everything was quiet. The people didn't see themselves having anything to do with what the priest was doing. So what did they do? They said the rosary, they did their May devotions, they did whatever. I actually found a book at our library in the seminary. It was How to Say Mass from 1932, and it was the actual textbook the priest used, and there were some handwritten notes in it. In the back it said, say Mass as if no one is behind you. What? That's a real problem if the head's off there and the body's doing something else. So what the liturgical movement wanted people to say is, pray, don't do devotions at Mass, as good as they are. Join yourself to the headship of Christ, and together you offer yourselves to God the Father. And so you should be able to see what the priest is doing. You should respond when you have responses. Basic stuff, right? Lord be with you, with your spirit. And suddenly that somehow, and the history needs to be written on this, how did assembling as the mystical body become gathering as the meal at the dining room table of God? And you do see that language. All the great scholars up to the late 60s were using this language, mystical body. You have the dignity as a member of the mystical body of Christ to offer yourself through Christ to God the Father. But then you read 1980, 1985, it should be a welcoming environment where people feel hospitable, and the church should not have any didactic quality. It should be a neutral space for the gathering of people at a meal that's akin to a domestic celebration. And that is not really in the Catholic tradition, as far as I can tell, until 1978 or 9. Largely it came from a document that bishops put out called Environment and Art in Catholic Worship. And they said, a church building, this is the most damning line in all of architectural history, theology, a church building need not look like anything else, past or present. That it's just a neutral gathering space like it was in the early church. It's totally destructive, anti-sacramental. We're out of time, so we don't have time to talk about that. But hopefully what you get out of this, or you take away from this, is architecture is complicated theological stuff, right? It's precise. Things mean things. There's an inherited tradition. In a sense, that's a traditio. It's the handing forward to the next generation. Columns mean things. Materials mean things. Siting mean things. Locations mean things. And they're represented poetically to elevate it beyond the mere mundane world, as good as the mundane world is, and to allow you to encounter the things that are beyond the world. This is just dirt. Pigments come out of the ground. But you make them into something, and then through the Holy Spirit's inspiration and mastery of the art, you can actually encounter by way of imagination the God who loves you enough, who says, I want you to be there someday with me, and I'll give you a foretaste. This is like the Emerald City in the Wizard of Oz. You always know where it is, except the wizard's a bad guy at the end, but Jesus is not a bad guy at the end. But as you get here, and then he hugs you and says, I made you and I love you and I'm glad you're here. And art and architecture and liturgy, all those things are that process of getting used to being ready for that for eternity. This is not a traditional versus modern argument as much as a theological argument. I mean, this is a pretty plain church here, right? No one would argue this is a 70s age church. Sometimes it's quite explicit in the Aristotelian sense, sometimes it's more abstract and then maybe in a Platonic sense, so there's a big range. But nonetheless, there's a theological reality that's manifested in a building, in a city, in a nation, across space, and all these things are how those things are marked. So thank you very much, especially to our building committee for doing very well.